welcome you all to the second in a series of lectures. They have been thought up by the Pasadena Art Council. So PCC is just one of many, many participants. And my name is Professor Trendler. I teach over in the Natural Sciences Division, usually teaching anatomy and physiology. The only current class I teach is our cadaver dissection course. So the topic of the day, we're going to talk about the anatomy of a tattoo. Two different focuses here. One is about the skin and how the skin is affected by the tattoo process, but also a little bit of information on the tattooing process itself. So joining me as kind of co-lecturers, if you will, two gentlemen on the stage. Sitting on the far left is Tom Halbrook, who is a tattoo artist with his own shop over in Arcadia, and sitting adjacent to him in the Boston Red Sox uniform, Ron Seary. And there you go. Of course, anyone getting a tattoo, I mentioned last week I was going to use a volunteer. Now, Ron is a volunteer, but he's the volunteer whose arm I could twist the hardest. He is not afraid of tattoos. He has a number of them. We're up to like 7. So let me give you a little information about the skin. You all have brought a huge collection of skin with you, your own supply of it. And when we are over in the science building, we talk about the fact that it's part of the integumentary system. Integument, that word comes from covering or protection, and there's a lot of protective cells inside of it. We're going to talk about where a tattoo goes and the tissue that it affects. So the most important thing to understand about your skin is it's got 3 different layers. The 3 layers are all named relative to one another. The outermost, the one that we see as we look at one another, is the epidermis. Underneath that, and notably thicker, is the dermis, and then deep underneath is a squishy soft layer called the hypodermis. There are a bunch of structures that help the skin be part of a system. None of these are really critical for the tattooing process, but you're aware that they give us some information and some protection. The hair not only on the top of your head, but all across the surface of your skin. Nails only on your digits, and the various glands. Now the glands are in effect up there on the stage because both Tom and Ron are under some stage light, so you might notice beads of perspiration. It could be from the heat, or it might be due to pain. So what we want to start with is letting you know what is in the skin, where the layers are found, and what we have, sort of the trivia of it. It is one of the largest organs. Now, there are different ways of looking at organs. It's definitely the largest in surface area since it covers everything else in your body. By weight, it makes up about 15% of your body weight, but you can't live without it, so don't try to lose the weight there. In comparison, inside your body, the liver would be the largest solid organ. The issue of where you're getting a tattoo, a lot of people ask, and probably will come up later, where it's most painful or least painful. One of the factors is the fact that the skin has a different thickness almost everywhere on your body. I want you to think for a second across the surface of your body, someplace that is so thin, the skin is so thin that you can literally see light through it if you're laying out by the pool. Your eyelids are probably one of the most thin areas. Compare that to the heel of your foot. Now ladies, have any of you gone and gotten pedicures? And they take that scraping device, it's actually like a razor blade, and they will hack away layers and layers of the heel of your foot with no visible harm. That's because that's one of the thickest parts of the body. And some of the thickness is due to distributions of fat. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So the outermost layer, I want you to think about, have you ever gotten a paper cut? You're taking your test or reading your textbook, whatever it was, your epidermis was injured, but do paper cuts usually bleed? No, the term avascular means there is no blood inside of the epidermis. The closest it gets is to the layer underneath the dermis. It's so thin that you can, of course, cut it or take it off with sloughing materials there at the pedicure shop. The dermis is the layer that the tattoo ink goes into, and we're going to look at some details of where the dermis will actually keep or retain the ink. It's got a lot of blood vessels. So one of the warnings we gave in the tattoo lecture advertisement was there will be blood involved. And if you notice what the two gentlemen have up there, before getting started, Tom wrapped a lot of the equipment. The chairs came from Harbison Hall. I don't think the Board of Trustees would appreciate sitting down where there was blood spots. So he's got saran wrap over a lot of it, and he's got gloves on. You'll notice at periods during the tattoo, he's going to be wiping away the surface, not only the ink that has come loose, but also blood that might be liberated from my sweetheart up there. And the hypodermis is a layer that is not technically part of the skin, but beneath the skin. It's the glue that holds the skin in place. And for all of us who have any issues with body weight, it's the layer we hate. It's the one that also will cause variable thickness. There's not a whole lot of fat in your eyelids, but other parts of your torso, there just might be. So if you take a look up here, this is a typical rendition of what the skin looks like from one of the textbook publishers. And if you look out on the right-hand side, you'll see the three major categories of skin. The epidermis, only making up that first sixth, it looks like. The dermis with this light pink coloring all across the middle, and it's definitely the largest. And down here, they don't show us necessarily how much hypodermis there can be, but they show us a sample. Now, if that was taken from the abdomen or the buttocks of someone, it could be all the way down to the stage floor, just so you know. So we're looking at what happens to this layer, the epidermis, as ink is being put down into the dermis. And you'll notice if we look across this section, here are some blood vessels that'll be leaking as he works. This yellow structure here and here, these are nerves. So watch Ron's face, see if Mr. Socks there has got, any expression changes. But really, one of the things to consider, if you yourself do not have tattoos and thought about it, you want to realize that you are actually changing one of the organs in your body. You better have a good reason to do it. A lot of people do it at the wrong time and for the wrong reason. I mean, everyone's heard a story of someone waking up, maybe with a little bit of a hangover and a brand new piece of art somewhere in their body they may not have thought out too well. Your skin serves a lot of purposes that are critical, even crucial for you. The one that we are most tampering with by putting tattoos on our body is the fact that the skin is a barrier. It is supposed to keep things out. And what we're doing with the tattoo gun, Tom is literally breaking that barrier thousands, if not millions of times, because it is, if you've ever seen a sewing machine's needle going up and down, it's a very similar process with ink rather than thread going inside. We also use our skin as a way of protecting ourselves from mutations. Anybody in the room who's lived in Southern California has probably had some sun damage, and we see it both as our wrinkles on our face, freckles if you were born without them that have shown up since you were born, and on Friday we had a talk by a dermatologist all about skin cancer. Now, skin cancers are becoming more and more common at younger ages. I'm still in my 30s, and I've had my first patch of skin cancer removed from my face this past summer. So what you have to realize is darker pigment inside of the skin helps to block the mutations. So I'm going to show you exactly where those cells are that need the protection. If you're Caucasian like I am, you need sunscreen. We don't make any pigment to protect us. But there is a benefit to getting sun, so the next time you're studying and you do have your sunscreen on, the skin has one amazing chemical reaction. It produces a vitamin. Now, can you think of some place that you've seen vitamin D? We put it into something. You might have had it on your Wheaties this morning. Okay, very commonly added to milk along with vitamin A. Vitamin D is created out of cholesterol. You always have cholesterol in your body regardless of how much you eat, and this is a good source for it. You want that cholesterol to be turned into vitamin D, but it requires the presence of sunlight. So UV is a necessary part. So you don't want to live in a cave, just put your sunscreen on so you don't get too much. Now, the other thing that tattooing really messes up is you have sensory receptors at every level in the skin. There are some that go right up to the epidermis, dozens that live in the dermis, and some are already down in the fat or the hypoderm. All of these are affected by the tattooing process. Some of them, of course, are going to be damaged beyond repair, and a tattoo will leave areas that are scars or dense tissue. The ones in the deepest area tell you how hard you're pushing. So think, across the surface of the body, people put tattoos on all different thicknesses of hypodermis. They have to push, the artist and the gun, until they hit resistance so they'll know how thick that is. So the difference between getting a tattoo on your neck compared to your arm is going to be a big difference in pressure because there's very little hypodermis up on the neck. And one of the things I mentioned, if they are sweating, that thermoregulation is taken care of by some of the glands in the skin. If you've ever gone outside and sweat, it was to cool off with evaporative cooling. You also may have turned white if you were outside and it was cold, or gotten the shivers. All of that is skin's response to different temperatures. But perhaps the most obvious function that the skin, when it has tattoos, is participating in is communicating to others. So whether you have tattoos or do not, you probably have a reaction to them. You may think to yourself, oh, that looks painful, I would never do that. Or you may recognize the character or the design. You may have a favorable or unfavorable impression. Certainly, if you've watched any of the TV shows where artists are putting tattoos on people, you have to consider what your family will think, what your job will think, if they show beyond the normal clothes outline. So up until now, you'll notice that my husband up there, Mr. Siri, on his left arm, just a tiny hint of a tattoo shows, and that bugs at least one of his bosses. The one that we're putting on today is going to show even more. So what we want to do for a second, the epidermis is being pierced by this tattoo gun, but what I'd like to do is switch over for a second and show you what is going on. The first slide we had was of skin, and the second of the tattoo picture. We'll see if you can see the outline that Tom put down. Jessica, you'll flip that button for me? So you may not be able to recognize in this close-up the image. We Were Married in Hawaii is of a tiki image, one of the gods from Hawaii. It's a very big mask with a person's hand sticking out, holding some flowers and a spear. So you'll notice that there is red irritation. That red color is showing from the deeper tissue, but it's showing through the epidermis. The epidermis is pretty transparent. So each time Tom puts his gun down, he applies some ink, like I said, like a sewing machine fashion, over and over again. It's going into the ink and into the skin, back and forth. And then as he wipes away some of the blood and any of the loose ink, he can see where his line has ended and where he has to continue. And now we'll go back and continue with epidermis. So the epidermis is the outermost, and it actually has a dense layer of cells. That's why the heel of the foot is so much thicker than the eyelid. The type of cells that are most abundant are called keratinocytes. Keratin is the key word because that's the substance that they make, but they are joined by the layer that makes pigment. Melanocytes are the ones responsible for freckles and black hair, eyelashes, and all that other. The melanocytes are the ones that protect you from the UV, while the keratinocytes are the ones that protect you from any kind of damage or trauma like we're doing today. The tactile cells would be the most sensitive of all the sensory receptors. If you've ever had, say, a fly land on your arm and you noticed it immediately, that was due to the tactile cells. They can even pick up the breeze in the room. And a very interesting group of cells that you may not be aware of, if you've ever gotten, say, a splinter in the palm of your hand, notice that over months and months it'll disappear. Dendritic cells are part of your protective white blood cell group. They'll go into the skin and remove things. They're considered macrophages. They eat away any foreign debris. So what happens to a tattoo over dozens of years? If someone got it in their teens, when they're 40 and 50 and 60, does it look just as crisp and clear as before? No, because your skin knows that inks are foreign, and they're going to eventually send cells after it to wipe it out. So sometimes people go back in, have things recolored or re-inked, or they may eventually need to remove them. So if you take a look, these pictures on the left is an illustration, and on the right an actual microscopic photo showing what the layers of cells look like in the epidermis. The colorful ones at the bottom, let's see if I can see, there it is. Colorful ones at the bottom are melanocytes. There's a tactile cell with a yellow branch going down. And all of the picture on the right is made up of keratinocytes. So that layer of protection would be somewhere, say, the heel of the foot or the palm of the hand. The interesting thing about melanocytes, we all have the same number. No matter how darkly complected a person is or how pale I may be, we have the same number. It's just how much melanin they make. And so one of the problems is melanocytes are stimulated by UV, by sunshine. For some people, they will begin to produce more melanin. They get that tan that then helps to protect them some. Others of us, the melanocytes really don't kick into high gear. Even when we get sun, what do we get instead? Is a burn. And the burn, again, is the color of the dermis being full of blood, like in the tattoo process, visible through the epidermis up above. So what if the tattoo gun only had a very shallow stitch? What if it only went down into the epidermis and didn't pierce the layer to the dermis? What eventually would happen to your tattoo is it would fall off, because as your skin is aging, it is replacing itself constantly, but the older cells are falling off. So if we looked at the border between the deepest part of the epidermis and the dermis, that's where there's nutrients. That's where your blood flow is full of oxygen and sugar, all the things that cells need, and that's where cells are dividing. So all throughout your body, anything that can divide and make more we call a stem cell, and your epidermis is basically made from stem cell division. When new cells are reproduced, the older stem cells, or the division from them, is pushed up and away, closer and closer to the surface of your body, and as they are going, they may pick up melanin. So the melanocytes don't keep it. The melanocytes are factories that give it to the other cells that are normally transparent. So melanocytes make melanin to put on top of the other cells, kind of like you put on your SPF, or if you've ever waxed a surfboard, you're coating the outside. But the problem is, the farther a cell gets away from the dermis, the more likely it is to die. It's starving, it's losing water, it's losing oxygen, and it's eventually going to fall off. What it needs to do before then is fill itself with keratin. And keratin is your protective layer. It's waterproofing. So it's not perfectly waterproof. If you've ever sat in a tub too long, you know the way your fingers wrinkle. That's because water is getting in amongst the keratin, but usually it will keep the water from actually crossing into your dermis and out. Can you think of an injury, if you've ever done some yard work, maybe you had to hoe or rake or sweep over and over again? What will happen to the skin where you're grasping that wooden tool? Okay, blisters or bulla. Blisters show you there's a lot of liquid in the dermis because it's a place where the epidermis pulls away. So you get a little bubble or a little pouch. That's because the dermal fluid is now trapped under a loose sheet of epidermis. You don't want to open those up. It's really common, right? They'll break on their own. Don't go and open them on purpose, or what you're doing is taking all of the epidermis's protection away and letting things land on the dermis instead. And maybe one of the most disgusting but misunderstood parts of the skin is that you're constantly losing it. Hundreds and thousands of cells a day are falling off the outside of your body. They're landing on your bed sheets and on your carpet, and that is what we call dust. Okay, so there are little organisms called dust mites that are very happy you're doing this. They live all throughout the environment with you, and they are why you don't want to go to seedy motels. So if you take a look now, these are all the layers of the keratinocytes and the aging process. Where it is darkest purple is where the active division is occurring. As they push up, they lose their color, and this line of purple in the middle is where keratin is forming. Notice the outer layer they call C. It's the corneum or cornified layer. That's all dead. Those cells are the ones that would rip away in a sunburn, could pull off in a blister, and make the dust in your room. So far we realize we're piercing the epidermis, we're making the ink go into the dermis, but there are already things waiting for us in the dermis that the ink has to displace. Mostly it's filled with protein. So you know that your food groups, protein is things like muscle. Well, it's also the hide or the skin. You think of the two substances we talk about from animal clothing, we use suede or leather. That's basically the dermis. It's very, very tough because it's filled with proteins. And the cells that make those proteins are called fibroblasts. They're making little pieces in the shape of fibers, like strings or yarn. And the number one protein in your skin is also found, of course, in the lips. When you hear about injections, is collagen. So collagen is like a thick form of plastic. That is what the ink is sitting in amongst. There is also a bit of elastic in your skin, so you know if you grab it and pinch, it's going to go back to where it sat. Unless you're very dehydrated or very old, when the skin gets thin, those elastic fibers break down. And there are also some stiff little pieces. There are also some stiff pieces of protein that help to give the skin its shape, and that's the reticular fibers. So if we were to look into the dermis, we would also see whether there was an artificial pigment in place. So the ink has to be something that is chemically neutral. It doesn't harm the body, but it is also going to be deposited and left for later. So as the body becomes aware of it, it is going to send out defense cells to try to remove it. And that's where we get the fading over time. As far as reasons to love or hate your dermis, there is a problem. Proteins all age. It's like the dashboard of your car. It's going to lose its integrity eventually, and this is where you are born with your fingerprints, but where you also develop your wrinkles. Now, the outlining process is the first step after picking your art, and that's what Tom has been working on. So we'll take a peek. Jessica will switch us over. Jess. And you'll see the two different colors across the top of the mask. It's still purple. That was the ink that was put down as a guideline. That was the outline or the tracing form. Places where it has become black or the brownish color are the outlines that he's doing. So you'll see just a little bit of irritation. You notice the background skin on this arm is becoming reddened compared to the rest of his arm skin. That's because not only the pressure, but also because every time that needle from the gun dives into the dermis, it is hitting some blood vessels, the smaller ones that feed the epidermis. So every time the needle pulls out, not only has it left some of the ink, it's probably bringing up a drop of blood as well. So the constant wiping away process. So I'm going to have to keep lecturing, give him more time. So what I'm describing is shown to you here kind of in a pictured format. You'll see on the left-hand side, there's the barrel of the tattoo gun. And in this case, it's showing a blue ink as opposed to the black. You see the layer of skin that was dividing and growing up and off, that epidermis. There's the epidermis, so that's being pierced or broken. That's why there is a chance of infection in any tattoo. You need to have some sterile conditions we'll talk a little bit more about. If this was a spot already done, most of these cells are going to collapse back together, but you've also introduced the ink. And so where there are hairs, some of those will be affected, all the glands and the nerves that would be in here. The two things you have to be aware of is your body is going to try to defend you against this, but there are also some ways to make it harder. And one of the newer chemical processes is that they're using inks that are in small capsules. That way the body isn't able to remove as much ink as it wants to. Now, just because the hypodermis is underneath the skin, we shouldn't ignore it entirely. It does add to the cushioning all over your body. And we call it the sub-Q or subcutaneous layer. Cutaneous means skin. So it's telling you this is really not the skin, it's underneath the skin. And unfortunately, or fortunately, both cases are true, it's mostly made of fat. And the technical name for fat is adipose. So some layers of adipose in your body are protective, those around your organs to keep them from being irritated, but vast quantities of adipose come from our diet and lack of exercise, and those end up usually in the subcutaneous layer. But fat has a purpose, and you've got to be careful. There are people who want to get rid of their fat for aesthetic reasons. It is providing your body with some valuable services. One, it is a barrier, a thermal barrier, helps to insulate you. And it's also a protective barrier, but also it is a source of energy. When your body is in any kind of starvation or crisis mode, it'll start to dissolve that. So you do need a backup supply. Also, from the health perspective, it has a larger percentage of blood vessels than do the dermis, and especially not the epidermis since it's avascular. So whenever they need an injection, they either have to go all the way into the muscles, the muscular injection, or stop at the hypodermal level. So if you take a look on the little picture, you'll notice that the bright blue and red blood vessels lie mostly in amongst the fat, which is colored yellow. Fewer and smaller ones are higher up. We don't ever want an injection of a tattoo gun's ink going that low, because then you have a major bleed. And you've got to remember there have been cases where people even trying to have their fat vacuumed out in liposuction have died because they are removing a percentage of the body's blood at the same time. So since we're dealing with adding color to the skin, let's deal with some of the normal colors that the skin can have. The first one I mentioned was melanin, and that's a protective color. You'll see that on the left-hand side, this very thin sample of skin shows a layer of little brown cells. And notice that the color doesn't stick completely to the lower level. You see some of it raising up. These are the cells that are protected. For me, this might be a freckle if we look down right here. and the rest of them would just be the normal pale color of Caucasian. But melanin isn't the only chemical that colors the blood, and melanin has different colors. So depending on your genetics, who your parents were and what part of the world they came from, you may have very darkly pigmented melanin, a black or brown color, or you may have something that's considered lighter, golden or yellow. Second color that we're seeing on Ron's arm as well is the color of the blood. Because the epidermis is transparent, hemoglobin is the chemical inside of your blood cells that both carries oxygen but also undergoes a chemical change when it's got oxygen attached or not. When oxygen is present in the bloodstream, it's a bright red color. You see it whenever you cut yourself. But if there is no oxygen in the vessel, like some of the veins of your body, it'll be a darker color that we associate with being blue or even purple if you've ever donated. And that's what's making his arm look a little red and irritated. And the last of the colors is something we only see when the skin is very, very thick, like the heels of the foot or on a callus. Carotene comes from the vegetable pigments in your tomatoes and carrots and peppers, and it can stain the skin wherever it's either fatty or has very many cells in depth. So one thing you have to be careful of, and this is just a little trivia, is that when you all decide to have families, babies sometimes have preferences for certain foods. You still have to give them a variety, because if your infant loved strained carrots more than any other vegetable, you would stain their entire body with carotene, and they might diagnose the baby wrongly as having jaundice, which is a liver condition where the yellow from your bloodstream is visible. But carrots alone will do it. It's where the pink flamingos come from. So if our body normally has only 3 major shades, this yellow, brown, and red or blue, what a tattoo can do is give you very, very different colors. And a lot of time people who are darkly complected, they don't opt for tattoos with colors since it won't stand out as well. So there's finally a benefit to being really, really pale. You'll notice on the screen I've listed some of the colors and what goes into the ink to give it its color. So in the upper left, you'll notice a piece of rock. That rock is carrying a mineral in it that's an iron oxide. If you've ever seen a rusty car bumper, the iron is the red color, and it's a ferrous molecule at the top. On the upper right, this coloring of the ink is too faint to be seen, but there's a cadmium or chromium yellow, and that's another one of the minerals you see coming out of the geology department. Lower left, malachite. You may have even heard this for the ladies being used in stones for jewelry. Malachite is something they commonly polish, and all of these can be ground up into very fine powders and added to a carrier fluid so that it can be made into an ink. So the fluids might be something like an alcohol-based or a glycerin-based liquid that that color is then injected with. And on the lower right, some of the other colors, of course. Any color in the rainbow can be used for a tattoo ink. It just has to be something that is safe to the body chemically and then in a fluid form. So with enough time, a person can have all of the colors of the rainbow. There are 2 different backs, posterior views. You'll notice that there are differing shades. It can be done with using multiple colors, bright greens as well as the darker, shades of red and white to clarify areas where there are edges. But there's even something newer now, is that there are some pigments now being used that are not visible under normal daylight. They are only black light fluorescent. So if you've ever gone into a haunted house or something for Halloween, these people would be able to wear normal short sleeves to work and no one would be the wiser unless someone turned a black light on. There have been problems, however, because this is a brand new style of ink. They aren't completely worked out, all the details. Sometimes it will be irritated by normal daylight. A person may feel where the tattoo ink has been put as itching or burning, and it also may fade much more quickly. So one of the things you have to think about is that it may become very popular to have tattoos in this day and age, but we're certainly not the first culture to have a lot of them. There have been cultures all across the globe. Ancient Egypt is one of the sources where they used like eye makeup tattoos to leave permanent eyeliner. It's a very common instead of having daily applications. On the left-hand side, you'll see a mummified human hand that was found. The age there, 5,300 years before present, what the initials stand for. So we're talking, back pre-biblical days, if you count backwards in time, and people were adorning themselves for various reasons. A lot of times it's a cultural mark. It says, I'm part of this group, and we see that still in this modern day and age with the military. There's a display right now in our gallery here on campus that show tattoos that have been chosen by people coming back from the war to commemorate their fallen comrades. So it's a really good thing to check out. And different cultures have had different ways of tattooing, but they all share one basic idea. You have to push the ink under the epidermis. Now in this day and age, because if you think about, we compare it to piercing one's ears, ladies. If you ever tried to do it at home when you were a kid and not get caught, it probably hurt a lot worse because you were using the wrong implements and you were probably nervous. Well, the old-fashioned way of tattooing probably hurt a lot worse. We have samples because some people still perform the ancient forms of tattooing. And you'll notice on the left-hand side of the screen is a modern contemporary. He's actually the husband of another one of our faculty. And Matt Rodriguez had this tattoo done in the Polynesian style of tattoo. The only difference is, instead of there being a tattoo gun, ink is put into a fine-toothed needle, sometimes coming from plant matter, like a spine from a cactus with the tip cut off, or it could be as large as an animal's tooth, a very fine bore. That's strapped to a stick, and the tattoo artist then hits that stick with either another stick or a rock for every point of ink. Now, Matt's tattoo takes up one pectoral region on his chest. It's probably, say, 3 inches square, both directions. The tattoo process took 11 hours. Took 3 males, full grown, in order to apply the tattoo because 2 had to hold his skin tense so that the tattoo needle wouldn't bounce off. So you'll notice the 2 pair of hands with gloves, both to the left and the right side, all they're doing is pulling the skin taut for the artist, and that stick with the little needle is what's visible in between their fingers there. In those 11 hours, they had breaks, they had to. Anytime any one of the 4 gentlemen needed to use the restroom or anything like that, but it was about 8 hours of straight work with the breaks interspersed. By the end of that time, of course, Matt had a wonderful tattoo. He also was really faint. And the amount of blood loss is much harder to predict when every single strike is being hand-delivered compared to a needle that can go the exact same depth every single time. So you'll see that that's a very ancient way of giving a tattoo. On the right-hand side, it was probably the precursor of the modern tattoo gun, something that had a needle that moved up and down, and it was back in the 1800s. So what Tom has over there, our video camera is really aiming at Ron's arm more than the tattoo gun, but you'll see in the picture on the screen, you have places for ink to be held, little cartridges there on the right, the needle itself sticking out to the left, and of course a power button so that you can decide when to start and stop. Each artist has his own gear, and this is where we get into some of the things you have to be careful of. The needles that go inside have to be removed and a new one replaced for every single person that we are getting tattooed. And if you were deciding to get a tattoo, the 2 things that usually stimulate a person first, you either have something in your head that you want. One of my tattoos is kind of to commemorate my mother who passed away. On that side we're Irish, and it's a Celtic knot design. So I knew before going I wanted something like that. And then you look on the wall. That's called flash, the art that is up there for purchase. You're basically giving a tiny, tiny commission to the artist, and there's hundreds of pictures. You flip to the right page that has either Irish things or Celtic things, and you say that one, they pick it out, they size it for you. But the other way to go about it is by finding a location that you feel comfortable with. And this is how I got to meet Tom, because Ron had already gone to his shop and had one of his tattoos done there. Ron has a number of tattoos, and I think with the gentleman, you tend to like things that are either scary or dramatic. So we've got a dragon and we've got a skull, but on the back of Ron's body is all the cartoon characters. Those are the ones I approve of. So we have Max from the Wild Things and Curious George, but that's, where no one will see them. So if your artist will do something as silly as copy Curious George out of a kid's coloring book, then you know you've got a good artist. And as you'll notice up here on stage, except for shaking his head, the key thing is you have to sit still. Various sizes of tattoos take multiple hours. In this case, we prearranged that probably Tom will only be able to do the outline of the image Ron chose. If we want to have it colored, the mask and the flowers and the spear, we'll probably have to go into his shop to have multiple sittings. Depends on how long you feel comfortable sitting still, how many hours you can use in a single day. The artist also needs breaks occasionally. And so what I was mentioning with a shop, almost all the shops will have the same standard art on the wall that you could choose from, but there are other things you need to look at. The needles are the part of the gun that actually pierce the skin, and every tattoo artist who has a certificate or a license has to have brand new needles sealed shut that you should be able to see them open. So maybe before you arrive, while Ron and Tom were setting up on stage, you want to make sure that he is putting a brand new needle into the gun before you get there. A lot of the other tools can be autoclaved or sterilized, but the needles are one use, just like you'd expect from a blood bank. And the other two things you've seen from the beginning, Tom has on gloves that are protecting him from any kind of bloodborne pathogens, and also the chair, the equipment, everything has saran wrap. So when we are done, all of the waste that has any blood or ink contamination can be treated for biohazards. Now, you don't know if you have necessarily any pathogens, but you certainly don't want your blood being passed around. So you want to know the shop is clean. You want to make sure they're willing to tell you that they have brand new needles. You want to take a look and see that everything looks like it's in order. But the worst case scenario is that you have a bad experience, and you don't want these things to happen to you. So learn from the mistakes of others. A tattoo that has not been sterilized properly could give you an infection. So this young lady had a design put on her foot, but notice the width across the ankle, that's edema, that's swelling, and this is multiple days after the tattoo, so notice how it's still red and irritated. That means the body is attacking something in that tattoo, either that came in with the needle or came in with the ink. It could be spread from the site as your blood flows throughout your body. The pathogens, if there was something in the tattoo needle, go away from the site. It could affect a much larger area than just the tattoo itself. And it used to be, maybe you've heard, people of course will give tattoos, let's say in prison. They're not using a tattoo gun and ink from a purchased shop reliably. If the ink is bad, the body will destroy the ink. So in this case, you see a tattoo that had one color in the center, a solid object that was not acceptable to the skin. It was something that was caustic, and that skin basically destroyed it. That part of the skin will not grow back. That area, so much for the tattoo design, now needs to be medically treated so it doesn't cause a worse infection body-wide. And of course, there are those times a person makes a mistake. The number one thing, the dermatologist said, don't get words. Don't get names, don't get words. If you pick an image, you can always change your mind, you know, what it represents. But if you get born to lose on your arm and you decide that you're not, it's going to take a very costly process for removal. The machine over on the left is a tabletop or desktop style laser, and lasers are the currently best method for removing tattoos. The only problem is they don't remove them completely. All they can do is speed up the breakdown. So we've already said your body wants to break down that ink anyway. It is sending macrophages and white blood cells to the ink to try to eat it or ingest it and carry it away. A laser just simply goes in and chemically speeds that up. So the laser process is not painful, but it's at least as lengthy as the tattoo application was, and it may take multiple sittings to get the level of fading that will allow a person to feel comfortable that the tattoo is gone. So you see on the right-hand side, the tattoo is still visible, more so than maybe those UV tattoos were, but the skin over time will continue to do the process of destroying it. And so you don't want something that is going to mark you for the rest of your life if you can't live with it for the rest of your life. So what we want to do is check over and see how the outline is going, but the Pasadena Art Council are the ones who came up with this idea, and a number of people have helped. Of course, Tom is sitting on stage left, and he has some cards with him if you are curious about his shop and going in to get a tattoo, as well as we'll do a little question and answer. On Tuesday of last week, another professor from the science department was the one getting the tattoo. That's Russ. Ron is sitting up there very very sweetly allowing me to use him as my lecture topic. The Dean of the Arts and Visual Studies area is the one who coordinated all of this and has come to see it as well, despite not having any tattoos of his own. And the technicians who've been helping me with the camera on stage is Shireen, and last week Jennifer helped with the videoing. So what I want to know now is if any of you have questions, I can translate and get answers from them. So the problem will be you either have to come forward and meet me halfway or yell, one or the other. If you have a question, best thing would be to come over on this side because then I could repeat it. Somebody's braid or loud enough. Switch over? Yeah.
I have a lot of tattoos, but I had one time we had tattoos done, and a friend of mine came back from vacation saying that the red ink had an issue, that she was allergic. What is that, and what does that mean?
That's exactly what you said.
Did you talk about that already?
Yeah. No. So the first question was, a young lady has had tattoos, but a friend of hers got a tattoo with multiple colors, and one of the colors became irritated. And as I showed just the different pigments, there are many different chemicals that can be used as the different colors. The problem is your body may be allergic to one of them. So the one color for red I showed was an iron oxide, but there are 3 or 4 different pigments that can be there. And unfortunately, unless you've had the same exact ink used before, a person won't know that they're allergic to a certain shade of red. So in that case, she would want to avoid that same red ink ever again, but the body will simply react to it.
Will it remain that way until it goes away, or is it?
Yeah, the localized injection of red is always going to be irritating to her body. Yeah. Other questions?
Now there are creams that fade the tattoo. I've been thinking about those. That's how effective it is.
Okay, we have a great idea. We'll test your A&P knowledge now. A young gentleman wanted to know if there were topical creams that you could put on the surface of your skin to help remove your tattoo. So in the case of being too cheap for laser, what would be the problem with putting something on the outside 8,000 dead epidermis cells? So there are very few things, and the only current chemicals that you kind of can topically apply have to have either a vitamin basis or an oil basis to be able to sink in amongst the keratinocytes. So as far as I'm aware, there's nothing that would be very effective because you put it on the top of your skin and the top of your skin just keeps falling off. I would like to thank you, each of you, for coming.